The NATO summit has wrapped up in Turkey, and the alliance is once again facing a debate over whether growing the alliance would strengthen European security or create new risks. Joining us tonight for our panel, Pyotr Kurzin, former UN official and geopolitical expert, Anchal Vora, international affairs columnist, Foreign Policy magazine, and Sergei Markov, former public spokesman for President Vladimir Putin. But before we go to our debate, let's get some background.
Since the end of the Cold War, NATO has steadily expanded across Europe, bringing in countries that once belonged to the Soviet sphere of influence. Supporters say that expansion has helped protect smaller states, strengthen democracy, and prevent new conflicts. But Russia has long viewed NATO's movement eastward as a direct threat to its security. Moscow argues that the alliance has moved closer and closer to Russian borders, despite earlier hopes for a new partnership between the newly established Russian Federation and the West. NATO rejects that argument, saying every country has the right to choose its own alliances, and that many Eastern European states joined precisely because they feared Russian aggression. Those fears only grew after Russia's wars in Georgia and Ukraine, helping convince Finland and Sweden to join as well. Supporters see expansion as a powerful deterrent. Critics warn it could deepen confrontation and divide the bloc itself. So, is expanding the NATO alliance the best way to bring security to Europe?
All right, and we are ready for our debate. Thank you for standing by with this backgrounder, and we're going to start in order. We'll start with Pyotr first. First question, is expanding the NATO alliance the best way to bring security to Europe? Pyotr.
Well, it depends who you ask. Also, it is Pyotr because I'm half Russian and half English, and so I have a unique perspective on this. I think that I have a lot of sympathy for how Russians feel, the growing encroachment of NATO over the past 30 years, but NATO's largest expansion, or most recent, came because of Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. When he did that on February 24th, that forced the Swedish and Finns to think, well, we need to be part of the alliance, despite Sweden having a very historical emphasis on neutrality. So it depends how you go about talking about expansionism.
All right, Anshal, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think there are two sides to this, in my view, as well. Those who support expansion would say countries that are a member of NATO have not been attacked. It's a defensive alliance. It has worked. Others say it's already big enough. If you make it bigger, it's unwieldy, it's ineffective, and defense commitments of the existing allies go up. And that goes against the argument that it should be expanded.
All right. And Sergei, what are your thoughts?
As you understand, Russia very much against expansion of NATO to the east, to our border. Okay, let's go to the west, north, south, but not to our border. It's our demands to the NATO. Nobody like if somebody with a lot of military come more and more close to your capital. It's first. And second problem that NATO was a real institute during the Cold War, but after Cold War happened, no threat from Russia, and NATO should be replaced.
Okay, we got to continue. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. The buzzer went for 30 seconds. We're going to start asking some more specific questions, and you could go on. But again, we're going to start with Pyotr on the next question. 1994, Russia joined NATO's Partnership for Peace. Has anything changed?
Well, no, actually, they're still part of it, as is Ukraine, ironically, despite everything that's happened since. I think what's more important as a stepping stone from the PFP was the establishment of the Founding Act by the Clinton administration in 1997, and then the NATO-Russia Council of 2002. These are critical demonstrations of NATO and Russia trying to find a way to engage the Russians, to engage Moscow. And early in the early 2000s, Putin was very pro-NATO. There was even discussion of actually joining the alliance as a full member, as they suggested in 1954 under the Soviets. But what's changed is Putin's relationship to the alliance. I don't think Bush's comments in 2007 helped over Ukraine and Georgia eventually joining. But certainly the Russians were important in working together with CTO, or counterterrorism opposition, counterterrorism operations in the 2000s. But the relationship has never really developed since then, and it only degraded as Putin got more and more paranoid about certain things at home, as well as the subsequent expansion by NATO in the 2000s, like 04 and 09, if I remember correctly.
Anshul, do you think, would you say that NATO's full purpose is to counter Russia?
Well, Russia is definitely the biggest threat, but the sole purpose is to defend territory of member states. That whole alliance essentially rests on Article 5, which says an attack on one is to be considered as an attack on all. Russia is seen as the biggest threat. However, you've seen at different times in NATO's history, NATO has evolved and has accepted other challenges, whether it is counter-piracy operation or, training with partner countries in Asia. So it's kind of like, every now and then expanded, as we saw after 9/11, it was alongside the U.S. in supporting it in its operation in Afghanistan. So it evolves. The biggest threat, yes, is Russia, and that's how it's definitely seen right now.
And what do you have to say about it, Pyotr and Sergei? Sergei first.
I think that Russian suggestion was very simple, that NATO, as the institutes of the Cold War, should be replaced by joint general European, whole European security system, which should include NATO and Russia. That's why Russia started cooperation with it. But then it's appeared to be that NATO didn't want to have such security system, but want Russia to be just junior partner, as they called it, new colony some kind of. But it's not what Russian agree. Russian independent country more than 5 centuries. And as a result now, we see NATO is a senseless bureaucratic institution. We're just looking for jobs. No real job threat from Russia. That's why they created new jobs for the salaries, budget, and so on for themselves. And as a result, NATO leading bureaucracy create artificial conflict. That's why leaders of NATO bureaucracy is main threat to the countries which is a part of the NATO. It's exactly they are who overthrown democratic government in Ukraine 2014, imposed absolutely illegal, absolutely criminal repressive regime which they have now, and they, as a result, they artificially created war in Ukraine. It's NATO job, fully NATO job. It's fully NATO responsibility. They're looking for jobs, salaries, monies, budget, and so on.
All right, Pyotr.
Yeah, let's look. I sympathize, as I said at the beginning, but I think that is a bit simplistic. Look, NATO is a voluntary organization. A lot of emphasis is on Article 5, but under Article 13, a nation state can leave at any point they wish to. They have to give 1 year's notification to the United States, whatever Supreme Commander. We had General Wesley Clark on my show a couple of months ago, and he argues just about this. The reason that NATO grew, partially because of perhaps budgetary or other monetarialistic aspects, as Sergei argues, I think it's more than that. I think a lot of the former Soviet states were genuinely concerned, most of all the Baltics, about the intentions of Moscow. Now, I think that these have been demonized. I do think Russia is demonized a lot in Western circles, especially hawkish ones like London or Washington, where I've also been working and based. But it's a voluntary organization, and they don't have to join. Finland didn't have to join. They were neutral, largely defensive, but they chose to join because they were concerned. And the relationship with NATO has gotten worse. Now, do I think that NATO are directly supporting the Ukrainians and therefore that this is sort of a proxy? Well, it's a reasonable argument. It's a compelling argument. But I think it's wrong to say that the NATO alliance is aggressive here. They've had plenty of opportunities to launch direct attacks into certain areas. Look at Kaliningrad. What's going on with that enclave or exclave, whatever, in parts of Europe? The NATO alliance don't do that. Do I think that they could have been better at consulting Russia and engaging Moscow? Yes, I do. But I think it's wrong to say that NATO simply has some kind of desire to destroy Moscow.
All right, Sergei, you want to pipe in?
Yeah, NATO is not a voluntary organization. Look, for example, Montenegro. Absolute majority of the people against this, but NATO's demanding President, the criminal Prime Minister of Montenegro, under investigation by Italy, for the very big bad criminal things, they impose that Montenegro should join NATO. Look again on the Ukraine. Before 2014, before this junta took the power, after Orange Revolution, it's absolutely clear that absolute majority of Ukrainians want Ukraine to be neutral, and they still now want to be neutral. But regime, Ukrainian regime, which was under the control of the Western countries, say, okay, our course will be to join NATO. So NATO is not a voluntary organization. NATO is
wild. That's simplistic. No,
Anshul, wait, hold on, let Anshul get in a second.
Because, yeah, I think with Sergei here, with all respect to you and whatever opinion you have, but Kyiv was invaded by Russia. Russia invaded Kyiv. That is a fact. Now that happened, and that is why countries. Allow me to finish, please. Countries. The neighborhood and NATO members had to know. Well, I don't know what your sources are, but I think
it's very simple. It's very simple. Ukraine was politically occupied by Western countries who were strong, democratically elected president Yanukovych 2014.
If you don't like a president, you can't say he's been planted. Or there's a president you like, he hasn't been planted. This does not make sense. Your argument does not make sense. I'm sorry.
Hold on, Sergei, we need to let Anshul finish. Anshul, let Anshul finish, Sergei. Sergei, let Anshul finish her point, please.
I'm sorry, don't interrupt me. Sorry, don't interrupt me.
Anshul needs it. Sergei, you're not letting Anshul speak. Please let her speak.
NATO is a defensive alliance, and it only intervened after Ukraine was invaded by Russia. I was here at the time. Nobody even expected Russia to actually go in and invade Kyiv. It wasn't even just about Donbass or East. It wasn't even just about Crimea, but Russia invaded the whole country. It wanted to topple the government. This was stated as one of the objectives of the Russian government. Ukraine is a sovereign state. Ukrainian boundaries have been decided in agreement with Russia back in the day. And that's when NATO countries got involved, not before. Before that, in large parts of NATO countries, the sentiment was to have a productive relationship with Russia, wander, durchhandel, the policy, the German policy. It failed. I don't know why you say no, because these are established facts. Did Russia not roll tanks on streets in
You don't know.
Pyotr. Sergei, you got to give other people a chance, please, Pyotr.
Okay, so I think what we're seeing here is indicative of this entire. It stands to reason. This is what the whole thing, the war, is largely about. I mean, Putin blames NATO. Of course, it's also more complicated around the relationship of Russia and Ukraine over the history to Kiev and Rus and all that. But the more modern element is it NATO's fault? Is it Russia's fault? And I think that this comes to the crux of it, which is that Ukraine is a country in a tug of war between greater forces. It always has been. I lived in Ukraine for a time, and you could travel freely to Russia whenever you wanted. You had visa-free travel, and Ukraine was quite happy being a quote-unquote neutral power, right? It had a decent relationship with the Europeans, decent relationship with Russia. But I think that the biggest crux has come from the push of the growing concern of Putin to put more and more influence in Ukraine over time, initially incrementally, more economically. And Ukrainians, especially in the West, Ukraine is a very multi-complex country. The west of Ukraine is more Polish or influenced by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Then you've got the Russian Empire, Novorossiya, which is western and southern Ukraine, heavily speaking ethnic Russian Ukrainians. I myself have that heritage from that part of the world. But the point is that Ukraine began, I think, to feel more pressure or coerced by Moscow and began to shift towards the EU. And we can see this with Georgia, and we can see this with Armenia right now. The more that Putin puts pressure, or you can use Taiwan and China as another example. The Chinese put greater coercion on Taiwan, and that makes the Taiwanese feel more independent from Russia, China, and it's the same with Ukraine. The more that Russia pushed, the more Ukraine was like, no, we want to shift towards the West.
Pyotr, hold that thought a second, because I want to throw in another follow-up. This is a good time, but there are reports that Russia may test NATO's resolve this summer. Yeah. Are those real threats?
I worry about the hybrid capacity for the Russians to probe. The Kremlin has been doing this with the Baltic airspace incursions. We've seen this in the drones that hit Romania, and Russia, said they didn't intend to do that. But this is the problem. This is a growing occurrence. The more that the situation within Crimea, especially, let alone the Russian economy, Sergei, I think you can agree with me that Russia's economy is not doing well right now. Putin is looking for ways to try and distract the Europeans from Ukraine so that they focus on themselves. So this is I think a provocative strategy by the Kremlin. But do I think some full-scale invasion is coming? No. But it's sort of like Russia will go into the Baltics. They'll occupy a town on the borders of the Baltics and then test the resolve of NATO. Will that be enough to get NATO to respond? And if they don't, then they'll try a little bit more. And then suddenly you've got 10% of the Baltic states' territory under Russian control.
All right, Sergei, what do you have to say about this?
General situation in Ukraine is NATO very simple. NATO occupied Ukraine 2014, imposed absolutely criminal repressive regime and making anti-Russia from Ukraine, who is, by the way, 80% their native language is Russian language. They prohibit language of the 80% of the population. They making tremendous political repression. Kill thousands of people, put to the prison dozens of thousands of people, and NATO supposes they want to make anti-Russia on the Russia border with a great strategic threat to Russia. How Russia can agree and look on the specific. You've been in Donetsk. I've been in Donetsk before the special military operation many times on the different conferences and so on. I wake up every night in Donetsk city because Ukrainian army shelling, making attack against Donetsk city every night. This is...
You cannot take over...
Anshul, yes, Anshul, do you need me to restate the question? Is it a realistic threat? Is it a realistic fear of Russia testing NATO's resolve this summer?
Security officials here tell us that...
Wait, Anshul's turn. Sergei, sorry, Anshul.
Hybrid.
Sergei, you don't let Anshul talk. Please let her talk.
In different formats. Drones have been flown in several neighboring countries, which are member states. So if you ask and if you talk to people here, they see this as quite a realistic fear. They're not expecting a full-scale invasion. I think they are expecting some sort of an attack on the Baltic states by the end of the decade. And that is why a lot of preparation here when it comes to acquiring key capabilities that they do not have, that they're dependent on the US for, that they now need to manufacture themselves. The whole gearing up of the defense industrial complex is essentially looking at 2030 and then 2035 as a deadline. This timeline is not just to increase your defense spending, but because the threat from Russia is seen as quite imminent in the next few years.
Okay, so I guess we'll have time for one more question. Is there a viable alternative to providing security besides Russia and NATO?
If that's to me, then no, not right now. Not for the security of European allies. The threat is from Russia, so Russia is not an alternative. For them, the only way right now is to keep the alliance together, to keep Trump on board, because the allies are dependent on the nuclear umbrella provided by the US and other key strategic components of their response plan if they do come under an attack. So it has to be NATO framework-led. The debate is whether it's going to become NATO only in name, and increasingly as it is more European-led, will it then become more an EU-led framework with still the big member states calling the shots? And this is, I think this policy is in the making, but here the consensus is that it's going to be it has to be NATO-led.
All right, quick reaction, Pyotr. We have 1 minute left. Final thoughts on this.
Sure. So look, I mean, again, this is a the underpinning of European security. The idea that sort of Russia can somehow take over all of Ukraine, but then somehow manage some massive military operation against the Europeans is where, you know, some of the arguments, I think, fall a little bit flat. But in terms of right now, this is a false binary. A lot of the determinants is based on what happens off the battlefield. The Russian economy is the most important element of all of this. But second, it's about Putin. If Putin is out of the picture and we get a more moderate sort of system in place, then perhaps, but nothing's going to change whilst that guy is in charge. You could talk about EU-led defense pillars, but I think the main emphasis is sort of NATO minus, the concept that NATO without the United States. I don't think the US is pulling out, but Europe needs to put the grounds on to be able to be capable of defending its own borders, be that Greenland because of the US. No, that's not likely. Russia because of the Baltics. NATO has to look to the north. It has to look to the south. It's got a lot of other fronts that it has to manage. And certainly right now,
Thank you all. Sorry to cut you off, but we have to go to a commercial break. Thank you very much for this, this heated debate.